Hello and welcome back to the Wolf Den podcast. I'm your host, Naco, joined by my co host, Anitsu. This week, we'll be discussing the topic of teching slash building a deck for an online event because it seems as though there are a lot of people out there that are wondering exactly how they want to build a deck when expecting a specific meta, and it'll at least give people out there the idea to get into our heads and what we think about when we're preparing for these events and how we approach certain questions that the meta is asking us to solve. So, I guess the easiest way to begin would be to ask Zenitsu um, early prep work for an online event. Where do you say you begin?
So I will take the deck that I'm going to be playing and I will immediately go to what is my deck doing? What are my tech options available to me? And then I'll start thinking, what am I most likely to see? And then I'll start planning and shifting my deck to try to beat my worst matchup because I should be already okay against my other matchups. And the worst one is the one I want to try to avoid losing to more often than not. So, I prepared, let's just say, blue hybrids for an event. I know that I personally struggle with yellow hybrids. This is just all hyperbole. I don't actually struggle with yellow hybrids. I don't think that matchup is that bad once you understand it. But if you don't understand it, you don't want to lose to it. So you would try to figure out, how do I not lose to yellow hybrids? What's yellow hybrids doing that I need to beat? And then you kind of just go from there on how the rest of my deck is going to be designed and influenced around trying to beat that one matchup while not losing the deck to just trying to beat that one matchup. And I think we saw that was a huge problem in previous events where people just teched for the wrong deck. Everyone was afraid of yellow hybrids when they should have teched for blue hybrids, and it just made their blue hybrids matchups a little bit worse because they were playing with cards that was supposed to beat yellow hybrids. So it is just kind of just figuring out what you are expected to see and trying to figure out what are the best cards you could use to beat that worst matchup.
So, that's a good point. Though you technically answered it without saying it explicitly. There's a um, pseudo step one that you acknowledged, but didn't call it step one, and I would say that that is um, when approaching a meta for an online event, you have to assess what like the big bad is of the meta. We had Lord Nightmon in BT5, we had Gabubond in BT6, we had Gabubond in EX1, and we had yellow hybrid initially, and now it's looking more like a blue hybrid as the deck to beat, so to speak. And my first question is, at least, um, it's a very binary choice. Do I want to be blue hybrid, beating blue hybrid, or am I just trying to beat blue hybrid?
And I think that's going to be a very hard choice for a lot of players to make because I like blue hybrid, while it is a strong deck, it still can lose. Like, I'm deathly afraid of the Cherubimon matchup. That matchup is not as easy as people think it is. So like if I was preparing for an event, I know that Cherubimon is a semi-popular deck. I know that's my worst matchup, so I would tech my deck against Cherubimon because that's what me as a player struggles against. So I have to evaluate what's Cherubimon doing and how can I avoid doing it with my deck options.
Um, I'm going to use specific examples for this only because it's a lot harder to think in theoretical spaces. I don't necessarily need to say what I'm playing this weekend, but I will still pretend I'm playing um, blue hybrids for this example, only because if I don't have a finite, like, I'm not going to pretend yellow hybrid needs to tech, or blue hybrid needs to tech for yellow hybrid, because it doesn't. It just kind of beats it. But um, the idea being that if we use real examples, it will provide real content for somebody, even if it's not. Because also, I don't necessarily think we're important enough to where someone's going to go listen to our podcast and then say, ah, Zenitsu's playing blue hybrids. I knew it.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just easier to pick on blue hybrids because it is the boogeyman, but
Hmm.
it also has like oddly enough, lots of choices, but not enough choices at the same time. It's a really weird deck that has like such subtle nuances to how well it could perform based on all of the different tech options that it has from being in blue.
But at least answering the first question again, the idea that I either want to be potentially the big bad or aim to beat the big bad or both. I know that's something that I chose the dark route, I guess, so to speak, in BT5. I felt as though Lord Nightmon was a strong deck. I liked playing Lord Nightmon, and I think more importantly, if you're someone who's trying to pick a deck for an event to begin the process of teching it, if you're picking the big bad, you're practicing the mirror almost exclusively, or at least preparing for the mirror almost exclusively. And answering the question to yourself is how comfortable are you or how fun does it sound to be playing blue hybrid against blue hybrid most oftenly? Not exclusively, but in a 9 round event, I would say 4 or 5 rounds will be a mirror if you're playing blue hybrid approaching these this weekend's events.
Unless you get really lucky and dodge everyone.
But that's, you know,
Yeah,
not not
that's going to be
likely.
the rare occurrence.
So, step 1 is if you are someone who will roll your eyes at the thought of playing blue hybrid into 4 or 5 rounds out of 9 of blue hybrid, with it only being more likely the further you make it in. Um, it really depends upon you as a person and you as a player and your valuation of blue hybrid, because if you truly believe blue hybrid to be a tier 0 deck, you have to be blue hybrid to beat blue hybrid. If it, based on our description or definition of a tier 0 deck. I don't believe blue hybrid to be tier 0. I will not be bringing blue hybrid, but at the same time, it is very easy to just think the easiest tools for you is potentially using the tools that you consider to be the best.
I would say that's a pretty fair assessment. But again, we're only picking on blue hybrid just because it's a very easy thing to pick on.
I'm also picking on it because it is the big bad of this weekend. I I'd be
It
very
probably is.
because at this point people are done experimenting. I know BT7 just got extended, but I really don't necessarily see there being another shakeup. I don't think any of the other hybrids are going to break through that blue hybrid ceiling. Blue hybrid just retains its dominance until we have more cards. Kind of case in point.
I think just mentally where the community is, that's just a very fair assessment because part of a meta isn't necessarily like what is the best deck, it's also what is the most represented deck. And yellow hybrids is still a very highly represented deck. Green hybrids is also pretty highly represented. Like there's still just a lot of other decks that people are playing that you still kind of need to be aware of, even if you are a top deck, because I don't know, you might not be expecting to play a green hybrid player and you just might not know how to face that matchup because you haven't seen a whole lot of it. So like that also is kind of semi important, even though theoretically you should just beat that matchup. Sometimes you just don't know what kind of spice they might be bringing to be able to tech against you. So not saying like you need to be able to tech against literally everything because you can't. That's just the nature of the beast, but like that's why tech can sometimes be important. And as we saw with previous events, tech can really get you far depending on what it is and what your matchups are.
Yeah, the as we've seen in the prior events, the decks are almost exclusively defined by their differences, not necessarily their similarities. Um, and just finding that the difference being between different players is sometimes how they play certain situations and how they use the tools available to them, but just having different tools available makes it so that they can have a choice in which line of play they go with.
And I think that's kind of why like sideboards, especially this early, was kind of a little bit of a mistake because certain decks just don't have the same level as tech as other decks based on either what archetype they're playing or what color they're playing. So like again, picking on blue hybrids, we saw that like let's just say my example, I'm deathly afraid of the Cherubimon matchup, so I tech in the classic collection version of Metal Garurumon for that matchup, just because I know Cherubimon's going to have an on play effect. I know they're going to want to try to use Cherubimon to get his or on delete effect off, not on play, my bad. And Classic Collection Metal Garurumon just shuts off the on play ability and gets rid of the card just for you playing what you're already doing. But that's something that's more specific to the Cherubimon matchup, so I might not want to tech that in unless I'm really deathly afraid of Cherubimon.
And it's something that, as far as these online events will go, the lack of a sideboard will force you to do all of this prep work have ahead of time. It's not something that will be more so of a skill-based thing in the match. It's more of you kind of have to prepare for certain matchups and dedicate deck lists or deck spots to those matchups, and then either you see them or you don't. So if you are a blue hybrid player that is afraid of the Cherubimon matchup and you dedicate deck spots to that, just know that card may hurt you in the mirror.
Right, and that's kind of like the give and take of how to evaluate what tech you should be using. Am I actually going to be using that Metal Gurumon tech? Well, if I'm that afraid of Cherubimon and I'm confident that my deck is good enough against everything else, then yeah, I would probably tech that type of a card in. But ordinarily, I probably wouldn't because that's a little bit too specific of a scenario to make that one card good, and I don't necessarily have the availability in that, or not me, but the deck doesn't necessarily have that availability to make it good otherwise. Like I was testing a whole bunch of really random jank with blue hybrids just to see what kind of stuck and what didn't, and my understanding of the deck kind of deepened because I was playing around with so many different tech options.
Yeah, that's a good point because um, approaching these events and these matchups again, if you're someone who is playing the big bad, everyone will be teching against you, and you kind of just have to expect that. So if you bring blue hybrid this weekend, then you're expecting the people who are playing against you to be familiar with the matchup. They're not going to see blue hybrid and go, "What does that deck do? What are their valuable cards? Which cards should I remove? Which cards do I not care about?" Like they understand your deck potentially almost more so than you do, um, because every time they play against blue hybrid, it's mostly fundamentally the same. Whereas playing as blue hybrid, you're not necessarily playing against blue hybrid as much, almost. Um, but as Nitsu said, these decks are almost defined by their differences, not necessarily their similarities, and being able to uh, show or utilize those differences in these matchups is going to be the key to getting ahead in, I guess, a larger online environment.
And that just is kind of the sentiment where it's like what do we value and how do we properly value it. So like one of the examples, going back and picking on blue hybrids, something that I saw nobody even remotely think of was Thomas and Mirage Gaugamon. So I was teching in that against the mirror, and I was testing to see, oh, I know what blue likes to do. Blue likes to draw lots of cards. I know what blue also likes to do, and blue also likes to bounce cards back to the opponent's hand. So I was sitting there and I was thinking, like, maybe Thomas and Mirage Gaugamon are a really good sub package to run just because, well, I could punish them for having lots of cards in their hand, which is what blue likes to do. I could multi attack with Mirage Gaugamon, who also has unblockable. So if like I'm going up against black for whatever reason, or some other decks that have defensive options, I could bypass them without needing to consistently stun. So like I was testing that package and it wasn't bad, it just wasn't amazing. And I wouldn't have known that had I not like thought of and evaluated like what my opponent could be doing and how do I counter that.
So, so instead of, I guess, what not to do, I guess we should potentially start to go over what to do. Um, Something that I believe I mentioned before, but Blue Hybrid, one of its strengths and one of the reasons I believe it is so good in this format is because it has fewer hard requirements for its deck lists. Obviously, they run the rookies that search for tamers and hybrids. They run the hybrids themselves, and then they run the tamers themselves. But the specific instances of those cards aren't as hard required. Obviously, you don't just run every hybrid. People aren't running full sets of Kendo Garurumon, um, either the BT7 version or the BT4 version. Um, but it's some combination of hybrids and cards that care about having hybrids underneath them or digivolving off of tamers. It's the abundance of additional deck slots, specifically because blue is one of the few hybrid decks that has rookies that enhance their archetype. So they're able to play on color rookies, which allows them to play on color eggs, which allows them to play the only color that currently has access to both floodgates. So I would say that is a staple, I guess, at this point, even though it is technically a tech option. You aren't required to play full play sets of either of the floodgates, but most people do.
And most people do because, like, again, what you just said, you have the deck space to do that. So, like, the reason why a lot of people started adopting red in green hybrids was because they were taking a look at what the deck was lacking, which was bigger damage output, which is what they're trying to do. And then they don't have as good as search tools, except they kind of do, but they kind of don't. But regardless, they just were lacking certain tools that red just tried to help shore up. So purple's another example where it's like, or not purple. Yellow is another example where it adopted purple to help with its control type of gameplay and actually delete the opponent's Digimon rather than just recover and hope it gets deleted from something in security. So, and all of these decks can do that because they have the deck space to do that because the hybrid package is just a small little package and you're just building everything to help support that one package.
We've even seen deck evolution as far as understanding components of cards within the deck lists. Um, Initially, more people were running the, I guess, more traditional uh, blue rookies or blue eggs in the form of Upamon or Demi V as an off, but uh, people found very early on that the card draw off of Upa, while valuable, isn't necessarily as relevant as card draw off of Floodgates that you've digivolved off of Kaiaramon, because you don't have to you don't want to swing with your Floodgates. You basically just kind of want to digivolve in raising, get your draw off of that, get your cycle, and then push that Floodgate out, and then technically you can use it to push your opponent over the edge if necessary, but for the most part it's just a static wall floodgating, and Kaiaromon, now I know I'm butchering that,
It's Kiaromon, but yes.
allowing you to um, just sit there and still accrue value off of its egg inheritable without having to swing with it. So that's, I guess, a really easy example of a transition of understanding value. And while Kairomon isn't as um, usable on the actual Digimon that want to be swinging, um, usually those are hybrids anyway, and they don't have eggs. So who cares?
Yeah, and we just see these deck evolutions as the meta like expands. We see this happen more and more, and that's something like as a player you kind of need to be aware of. And like that just goes into part of like card evaluation, card analysis, and card decision on what you should be running and why. And that's kind of like the whole like core theme of text is like what am I running and why am I running it? Because your tech might not even be a tech against some other deck. It could just be a tech to enhance whatever your deck is also trying to do. So, like blue hybrids, you could, like I said, tech in the Mirage package because it's still a tamer that you're going to be playing. It has a native playability, so you're gaining some instant value, and you have a general level 6 that it plays with, to help propel its more aggressive lines of play. And that's kind of why a lot of people leaned towards a Zulong, is because it's another really solid, generically decent level 6 that doesn't really require much of any effort in order to easily run in. But the beautiful thing about the deck is you don't actually need to run any level 6s at all. And that's kind of like the magic behind why certain tech packages can really help not only just counter the opponent's deck, but propel your deck forward as well. And that's why a lot of people, going back to green hybrids, plays red, is because it's not necessarily trying to counter something the opponent is doing. It's to try to help their own deck propel itself forward.
That's a good point because um, it's a fine line that decks uh, lie on, where you don't want to make your game plan worse or less efficient just to try and disrupt your opponent. The beauty of this grace period that Blue Hybrid falls into is unfortunately that they can advance their game state, advance their board state, while still riding very general lines and still messing with and actively inhibiting the opponent. Um, Recently, just through playing against Blue Hybrid, I've found that Blue Hybrid is this weird duality deck where it is an aggro deck at its core, technically, but Blue does have control elements that they've tried to implement throughout various sets and make work, and this deck just touches upon them just so that they can basically win the aggro versus aggro matchup essentially while controlling their opponent as if they weren't an aggro deck.
And yellow hybrids also has that kind of, well, its duality is less so, but like its duality comes from just more like control, as a like just hard control. It's just like they're playing they're playing the purple package because of Schwartz Lizard's interactions with the amount of tamers that you have to try to clear the opponent's field. But the inverse is, because they're doing that, they struggle harder with one big stack. So that's why some people still like teching in Shine, to try to help deal with that one big stack that they can't deal with otherwise because of how they text their deck. So like certain decks do just have the availability to cover lots of their bases, and those are the types of decks that people are leaning towards and playing more of. And I think Cherubimon's another really good example of this, where it's just like it could deal with wide boards very easily against the opponent just because of them playing their tamers naturally and going up into Cherubimon. But they don't really have a good answer for high level Digimon, and that's that deck's big weakness, where it's like, shoot, how do I actually deal with this Digimon, especially if it could unsuspend itself, not leave itself open for retaliation, or they just sit on it for a passive for whatever reason to just try to shut off what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I guess therein lies the flexibility of Blue Hybrid because they don't have a face card, so to speak. Um, we Something Zenitsu and I were talking about earlier is that a lot of the hybrid decks, I guess, besides green hybrid and red hybrid to an extent, it's a little different because they have like their own separate package, not just a hybrid package, but um, Blue Hybrids doesn't run the Blue Hybrid level 6. It doesn't run Ancient Magnatheriumon. Like it it doesn't care. It just has other more efficient, more playable level 6s that it can utilize depending upon the needs of the given instance. Obviously, um, some decks have opted to run just a Zulong. Some decks have opted to run a combination of Hexablow and a Zulong. Um, and earlier on, before they were more leaning into the source removal, source control elements of blue, they were just relying upon that separate sub package of Magna Garurumon, and that was their only level 6 that they needed.
And like the deck just works no matter what level 6 they teched in, because that's all it was just a tech in. Like it wasn't changing their whole game plan around that one card. That one card was just enhancing their gameplay or making a matchup in particular easier. So as like, again, don't really mean to keep harping on blue hybrids or like praising blue hybrids. It's just the easiest example to show the different tech possibilities. If I was really afraid of yellow, I would play Azulon just for the security tech plus. If I was really afraid of red, I would probably tech in Magna just to get some quick to easy damage in, because I know they're going to be focusing on one stack. And if I use Magna correctly, I could also get rid of that stack. I'm referring to Magna Garurumon. And like that just goes to show like each of the different options that that deck has isn't changing the fundamentals of that deck. It's just changing how you answer certain questions.
So I know you mentioned it before because it was just the easiest solution at the time. So um, I'm not 100% sure on the data of it. I know play limitless has been less utilized in recent weeks than it had been in the past a little bit. People are kind of waning off of BT7 already. But um, with the side decking events, that EX1 Metal Garurumon, its ability specifically targeting the on delete Digimon, um, allowed Blue Hybrid to play that in its sideboard to get over those matchups where it the opponent was utilizing highly powerful on delete Digimon, most specifically Cherubimon. So, but for this event, since they don't have side decks, they really have to assess whether or not that matchup is that dangerous and that common enough to warrant running any of them, or I guess a minimal amount of them, to help their win rates in those matchups.
And this just extends to more than just blue hybrids. A lot of decks have just that hard answer or hard question to try to answer, and sometimes there just is no good answer, which is why you generally want to prepare for your worst matchup, so that way you know at least you have your worst fears covered, and you'll take the risk against some of your other matchups. So your worst matchup might be the mirror, it might be something else entirely. Doesn't necessarily matter. Um you just need to evaluate like what that is, and sometimes that's going to be the hardest thing, is like I don't know what my deck is weak against. Whether that's through inexperience or whether that's through over experience, and or just the wrong type of experience. Like I had no idea Cherubimon was such a hard matchup for me, personally, until I played it a lot more, and I was just like, oh, now I'm a little bit more comfortable with it. But before, I had zero idea what it was doing. I had zero idea how to stop what it was doing, let alone what I should be doing myself outside of my general ABCs and one, two, threes. So, like, play knowledge and matchup knowledge are like very important things, because sometimes you might tech in the wrong card thinking that it might help, and then it might not, because it might not see play, or it just might do something completely different based on how you've been playing and trading that matchup.
Yeah, I guess it really just goes back to the greater point that we mentioned earlier about how you don't want to detract from your game plan, um, especially in a world where you don't have a sideboard. Like I guess at this point I would say don't run EX1 Metal Garurumon, because as much as it is a helpful card in the Cherubimon matchup, I just don't think that's common enough. I mean, I think Cherubimon was the fourth or fifth most played deck, and there's quite a steep drop off. Like I think Cherubimon and Red Hybrid and Black X Antibody combined are roughly equal to either Blue Hybrid or Yellow Hybrid in play rate, at least.
Yeah, and like that's just going to the overall meta analysis, is just like what are people playing, and whatever advantage you could get in terms of like just what people are talking about online, what you notice in watching other people's streams, what people are playing more casually or just playing in general. Like just any bit of information that you could gather could help you make a tech decision, even if you're afraid of like a particular player. So let's just say I don't want to like pick on somebody, but let's just say I was afraid of playing X streamer who I knew was going to be in an event, or X YouTube creator. Um, then sometimes watching them, knowing their ins and outs, and how they play might give you a slight advantage. But like that's a little bit too narrow of something to focus on. Just going into an event saying I want to beat this person, you might not even see that person. Same thing with like how you could tech your deck, you might not even see those decks. So you want to tech in for something as broad as you possibly can.
Yeah. That's I guess the general rule really is um but make sure you tech somewhat, I guess, is while a lot of these decks you'll see are similar. Like I know from some of the Digifests, Blue Hybrid took 6 or 7 spots out of the top 16, but they all ran different amounts of certain cards, you know? And knowing yourself and knowing how valuable certain board states are to you, how valuable certain lines of play are to you. Are you someone who's running 3 Davis? Are you someone who's running 4 Davis? Are you someone who's going to run a small Magna Garurumon package? Are you going to run no Magna? Are you going to run a larger Magna Garurumon? Are you going to run the full 4 of the Tamer and then maybe a 3 or even 4 of the Magna Garurumon himself? It really
And
depends on
this
how you value the package.
And this even extends to like some of your core engine pieces too, where I've seen people where it's just like, are you going to be running 2 Pokemon, 3 Pokemon, or 4 Pokemon based on what you're expected to see? Because that card is something we always have to hard play. That card is something that has a very specific use that the opponent might be trying to counter. So, like, those types of decisions go into like what ratios you're going to be running into your deck.
So I don't really know what else to say about blue, but maybe it'll make more sense to some people if they aren't playing blue and just moving beyond it. So um, I significantly less played, but it's second most deck that I'm experienced with at least is Black X Antibody, and Black X Antibody has a significantly higher pool of cards at least that are playable and techable, only because you only have so few X Antibody core pieces. I guess outside of the core pieces, I would say run the maximum that you can of those. The only thing in my latest build specifically is I don't run 4 copies of Alphamon, but that's only because I found for my sanity and for my ratios, 7 level 6s is my optimum level, so I'm running 4 copies of Dorugoramon and 3 copies of Alphamon. Outside of that, I'm running 4 copies of all applicable X antibody Digimon. Um, but that being said, that's only for 8, 12, 16, 17, 18, 19. So I have 19 out of a possible 20 X antibody
Don't forget
Digimon.
your tamers. Yeah, don't
I
forget your
mean, I
tamer.
guess. So sure, that's 20. I add 4 copies of Coda. That's potentially debatable though. Um,
I don't know.
because
I think Coda's just too good to not run. I mean, granted, right now because there's a limited number,
well,
like
that's the
you
point.
could get
Is
away with Izzy.
19 out of 19 out of your 50 cards are X antibody, and Coda doesn't hit himself. So you can't count Coda into that number. So Coda's revealing top 4 and adding 1 X antibody. It's only hitting 1 of 19 cards. Um, so potentially running 4 Coda is wrong, especially because outside of that he's just a memory tamer. There's no benefit to stacking him at all besides the additional searching capability of playing him for 4. There's
Nah, man,
nothing
Grumblemon.
there's nothing that cheats him out. But but that's what I mean. So if you're going to run higher quantities, I have opted for I guess this is why I brought up X Antibody, like A because I'm familiar with it, B because it has more variation. Uh, because of its flexibility, there are very different directions it can go. While mechanically, a Magna Garuru blue hybrid and a Magna Garuru less blue hybrid are fundamentally different. They're not that different, not as different as, say, a black blocker X antibody or a black Zubagan X antibody.
Well, I'm just to hammer home the differences that you could run in your sub package. I'm running X antibody cyborgs, so I'm electing to use a lot of mid-level cyborgs just because, well, I have Hagurumon, which helps me draw, and then I have Zubagon Punch that could turn on the BTO2 Metal Greymon because I could give it reboot because my Dorogoromon could be larger just naturally because of Dorogoromon. So like there is just a lot of like sometimes these incomplete packages could lead to a lot of extra creativity because we have to shore up the weakness in what we're missing with something else.
So, when assessing what you want to build and what you want to bring, you just really need to figure how you want the deck to play for you and how you want to play into whatever you expect to see. Um, I have gone with a more source agnostic approach with this list, mostly because for my testing, I've gone up against a lot of blue hybrid. And nothing hurts more than playing a deck that cares about its sources and assembling very specific sources just to have them stripped out underneath you.
And I guess for a similar reason, that's kind of why I'm running the Cyborg package, is because I get access to Tankmon, where it's like he doesn't have an inheritable ability, so I don't care if he gets stripped. And on top of which, he's a cheap card to start climbing the stages with to be able to get me to my end goal faster. So, like, just between the differences between mine and Nako's build, we're still thinking of just trying to solve the same problem, just different approaches to that problem.
Yeah. So while we don't have answers specifically, as far as I can't tell you what to tech for, what not to tech for, um, there are technically no wrong answers. There are wrong answers as far as, statistical probability. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say anyone needs to tech against Aospawn. If anyone plays an Aospawn, please let me know. You're probably the only one. Um, or one of you plays Aosmon and then just lets a bunch of people farm views or something because hey, I played Aosmon. But just you know what I mean? The idea that and maybe that's something that you want when deciding your deck. You want to take something. I know I don't remember the player specifically crap, but like there were very few black wins in placings in tournaments and they were with very interesting, very unique builds all piloted by the same player. And that player basically decided instead of playing into the meta and teching for the meta and having everyone know what they're going to expect from me when I flip my first egg or play my first card, I'm going my own way. Like and that requires a decent amount of dedication and a decent amount of skill as well as acute awareness of the meta and the play state of the game. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But if you're someone that is really deep in the weeds to some archetype and you think you found a niche to carve out, by all means do it. Because honestly, I feel like I've lost more games at lower tables after losing like the first round or two in locals to decks that aren't meta playable at all. Like Retaliation Myotismon, I guess is the really easy example. That deck I just had no clue how it played because I had never played against it before. And sometimes you win that way, and all it counts is once because you see that person once in a large tournament, they see your deck for the first time, and they fail to beat you. and you move on and you play that same game again with someone else who's never seen your deck before potentially.
And I think that's kind of why like our meta differs so much from Japanese meta is because like their meta is best of one. So if you lose that matchup you had zero idea even existed, yeah, that feels pretty bad. And then decks like that actually have a higher chance of succeeding because of that surprise unknownness. Whereas in the English meta, because we play best of threes traditionally, we don't really have that much of a problem. So like those weird rogue decks that are just so far out of left field don't generally do very well because they have to prove themselves more, and that's harder to do, especially when the opponent has time to figure out things, adapt, and learn to what your deck is doing.
Yeah, that's true. The idea of a you'd have to basically uh, either play weirdly enough or play uniquely enough to where your opponent can't really figure out your strategy, or at least can't figure out and then adapt to beat your strategy in the span of 2 games. Three, I guess, if you go that far. But um, the point that you just reminded me of that we haven't really brought up yet is the idea that um, depending upon your personality play wise, um, even between Zenitsu and I's own various versions of like Black X Antibody, um, you can establish different um, lines of play based on your personal preferences as far as how you want the game to go. And I guess really what I really mean with that is just the idea that um, mine is a very binary one-shot stack blowout deck. I'm not necessarily giving my opponent the time to figure out what I'm trying to do because by the time they know what I'm trying to do, I've done it. Unless I completely fall flat on my face, I kind of just run up the stages. I have one of two level 5s that both give me security attack +1, and then I swing, preferably with a Zubagon punch. And and that's kind of it. And it was actually a quote from one of our better players locally too, like one of the I guess the in crowd so to speak, usually top 8 at a minimum out of 15 16 people. Uh and I beat him in the first round of an event earlier on in BT7 and his exact words were I didn't know that deck could do that, you know? If people haven't played against a one-shot version, they don't expect a black deck to OTK them if that's something that people haven't played against. Now, other decks have their own tools for that, but usually you don't have that same uh, level of satisfaction or safety, more so, I guess, safety, if you're playing like a Jesmon, because they expect Jesmon to blow you out. That's what Jesmon kind of does, and they'll be more prepared for that. Like, I know, like, specifically the player he I did evolve into my level 5 and pass turn. He didn't realize he only had one more turn.
That's a very fair point, and like bringing up like the meta and surprise factors and all that. Like I used to play competitive Hearthstone back in my collegiate days. I was the captain of our collegiate team. Um, that's not really a huge accomplishment by any stretch of the word, but I've always been just in the I've been trying to up my competitive game, and I noticed a pattern in a lot of card games where usually a meta starts with aggro and ends with aggro. So what that means is essentially that like usually at the beginning of a meta there's just a lot of unknowns. New cards are being tested and like you just don't know what to do. So the best course of action by default is to just play the quickest lowest to the ground thing you possibly can, so that way you don't necessarily need to I don't want to say learn, but you don't need to accommodate yourself as quickly to what people are trying to do and what they're testing, and then you just beat them because can't necessarily figure out what their own deck is trying to do as well. We're in the more mid stage, where the mid stage usually leans more towards like familiarity and control. So, like, usually once a meta is more solved, people start to get more relaxed, and the testing phase is kind of over, and they'll just play the best decks, which are usually more mid range tempo or control based in Digimon. Um, and then once people are towards the end of the meta, then they kind of just give up and they just don't care. They want to have fun. So they just start ramping things up and trying to race each other again. So that's kind of like the cycle of like generally how a meta kind of evolves and shapes. And I think Digimon still kind of adopts that, like, a meta begins with aggro and ends with aggro. And part of that is also in the tech that we're using, because as you could see, we started slowing down on some of the tech that we were using, and we're using more control based tech for various different matchups. And a lot of control decks are still super more popular, especially during the mid stages when they actually know their matchup knowledge and they have that matchup knowledge to perform better than they did at the beginning of the.
That's actually a really good point. Um, I've noticed similar trends, and I know specifically in Magic, it was almost a staple that the easiest way to perform well when a new set came out was to just bring the best aggro deck from the previous set, even if it's not necessarily as meta playable um, or if it could be better from implementation of new cards, just because you know how to play it, it and it does what it does very well, and it basically doesn't suffer from as well as it punishes the experimentation process and the inconsistencies that these newer decks have. When a new format comes out, new cards are tried, new cards are tested, and before people know, am I supposed to run 2 copies of Magna Garurumon or 3 or 4? And they're not sure, and they're running various amounts, and it's clogging up their hands, it's clogging up their plays, and while they're trying to figure out, like you said, what their deck is supposed to do, you just blow them out. And um, I do think that this kind of comes full circle. I would say we're more towards the later end, because even though we're not necessarily actually at the end of the format, I think we've already hit the point where people are comfortable. And when people become comfortable is also when you can surprise them in that same fashion with aggression, because it's more of a dance than it is a strategy game to some people at this point, because especially if it's a familiar matchup to them, I'm playing blue, you're playing yellow. We've played this 100 times. If anything, I've almost been in exact same situations with very similar board states and very similar hands options. Like I know exactly what to do in this situation, or at least I know what not to do. And that's when you can take a deck that is potentially not as quote unquote meta or quote unquote competitive, um, and really, shock the system a little bit. And especially if you're a skilled pilot and a skilled deck builder. Um, it's something that Digimon does very well. That I believe the skill expression of building a deck and then piling it well really comes out as to like the consistency or the inconsistency of a deck. And something like I know Lilith Loop um, really shows that. And someone who has fine-tuned their list and makes it work for them and their play styles and how they want it to play can go quite a distance compared to someone who's just copying the list of the week and bringing it to an event untested and almost cold.
And like, I was watching, huge shout outs to Jodabi. I was watching one of his streams, and he was playing a deck that was on nobody's radar. Nobody would even expect to know what it does and how to do it. And it's not like I haven't seen the deck 100% before. I've seen the concept before, but his implementation of the concept was just so out there that, like, he could take that to an event, surprise a lot of people, and get relatively far in that event. Whether he'll win or lose, that's to be determined based on his own skills as a pilot. But the deck that he crafted and what it's trying to do is something very out there that I don't think people would be really prepared for. And especially since he tuned it for this current meta, he has the possibility, because of just what he did, to surprise everyone and end up doing relatively well. Um, I'm not going to exactly spoil what that deck was. If you've watched him recently, as of the recording of this, you should kind of know what it is. But regardless, it just shows that there's a lot of experimentation that's also not being done. So, like, going back to the meta starts with aggro and ends with aggro, it clearly shows that we prepared for the wrong deck in the beginning, because, like, everyone was still trying to figure out what is the best cards for yellow hybrids. Meanwhile, blue hybrid players were just like, look, we really just don't have a whole lot of choices in terms of like things that we don't want to play. So they just run literally almost what they've been running. It's just a little bit more refined now because of just the changes in the meta. But like that's why it was able to do something, and that's why it was able to take a lot of events relatively quickly, relatively early, because people were still learning what their decks were trying to do, and it was already just a very easy, simple deck to just beat face, select the opponent's Digimon, and make sure that they didn't have a good time, and that's exactly what happened. And now, since we're like time wise is a little bit different than like what I described. Like Neko just said that we're more towards the end of the meta. I would probably say that's true because we should have been done, and a lot of people are done experimenting. Except the experimentation should never really stop, and that's when you could find some more creative things to do to surprise the opponent, to like be able to get some. I don't want to say easy wins, but get some sneaky wins.
Yeah, especially in longer form events. Um, it it even puts people out of practice potentially like on the day of. If you're someone who's played 3 rounds of blue hybrid and then the person across from you, flips and they're suddenly playing into Gabubond or Agubond or Jesmon, just it's it could be that simple. It could be that simple of just you're prepared for them and they're not prepared for you, especially if um they are playing something that you are prepared to play into, you've teched for, and something that you've practiced. Because I think that's a major component that we can't really talk about too much specifically or explain it because it's kind of just a personal thing, but it's really just getting the games in, and it's something I know I've been guilty of in the past, especially in these longer formats where I'll just read about a deck online, kind of fall in love with the concept, look through a couple deck lists and piece one together, and then just kind of run with it almost cold, and it doesn't necessarily always work. Um, I think my best example of that was BT5 Black Milga because it was my first time trying black competitively. Actually, I guess like besides like trying from afar as how bad it was, but the first competitively viable black deck to me really kind of called out to me, and I went through its list and I went through why it was good and what it was good against, and more specifically, something that I really wanted to do is I just absolutely despise playing against security control, and that deck ran down security control. I don't even care if I lost to every rookie rush I came across, because I did. I beat every security control player, which was one, but you know what I mean.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes you just play those, and you just expect to see your most favorite matchup, just so you could feel really, really good about it. Like I play that way the same with red hybrids. It's just like as a red hybrid player, I'm just like, please, please, please let me see yellow hybrids. It is the most free win I could ever ask for. That like it's like awkwardly enjoyable. And there's not really a whole lot that yellow hybrids can do that's really gonna stop me, and that's kind of why I, like, really like that match, because it just feels so, it feels so good being able to overwhelmingly beat the opponent, especially if you have practice underneath your belt. And that's what your deck was designed to do. It's just like, even though I could lose against every other blue hybrid player, it's just like if I beat that one yellow hybrid, like that's my personal victory. I'm like, yes, that felt good.
Well, I mean, depending on which deck you thinks are popular, which decks you think you're going to see at least, um, when looking at like these weekends events, um, what would we say? X2, right? As long as you have um,
Yeah, X2 is
or,
usually like where you want to be at the end of an event at worst. If
yeah,
you're like X3, you're hitting some very dangerous waters,
some amount of
especially
X3, not because we not accounting for ties, which if people continue to play yellow hybrid, there will be a bunch of.
people really need to stop playing yellow hybrid for that reason. Either that or it needs to play yellow hybrid and then I'll play it and we'll
I'm
see
fine
how
with
things
people
go.
playing yellow hybrid because
Like the sad thing is like yellow hybrids is like interesting of a position, and we've mentioned this before where it's just like the amount of ties it gets, especially against itself, is like really bad, and reasons why you probably shouldn't run it, but people run it anyway because it's a good deck, it's popular, it's strong. It's like blue hybrids has the availability to basically be almost anything else in the meta. um but it just loses to itself so badly, and it doesn't even lose to itself. It creates ties, which could then, if enough players get enough ties, could cut the tournament short, which is ironic.
that's why I like it. That's the only reason is because I feel like the deck I'm prepared to play doesn't necessarily struggle against it. Not saying I won't lose to it, because if I play enough of it, I will probably lose to it. But um, I'm at least confident in the matchup. I'm confident in what they want to do, and I'm confident in what I want to do. And um, I believe I've built my list to beat both blue and yellow hybrid, and at the same time, I'm practiced enough against blue and yellow hybrid to encompass most of the meta, I guess, at that point. I'm mostly afraid of playing more offshoot decks that are not necessarily as common. I'd be more afraid of a purple cherubi or a green hybrid or a red hybrid, mostly just because of a lack of familiarity. I'm not as practiced versus those decks as I am blue and yellow.
Yeah, like practice and understanding your deck and how you play is definitely a huge part of it. Because like sometimes you just might not want to run the in quotation mark best option that everyone else is running, because it just might not fit with your playstyle. You might be able to adapt your deck to better incorporate something else, and that's something that's also a hard skill to understand and come to realize is like everyone plays differently. The same deck that you copied online off of somebody else might not work the same for you as it did for somebody else. You might not have the understanding what went into that deck and why cards are being played, let alone what you should be doing to change that deck to really um, get it to be where you want it to be. And it does take some amount of play testing and experience to be able to come to terms with that.
I do believe Digimon is at a point where there are correct, more correct decks to be bringing for events. Just statistically, like if you are someone who is playing, but I guess it's still a fairly broad pool because we've labeled what 5 or 6 different decks: blue, yellow, purple, black, red, green, like one of each color, I guess, essentially.
Yeah, and Cherubi. Well, Cherubi is
Purple is
purple,
purple,
yeah.
yeah. Um, so one of each color at a minimum, like the best deck potentially of each color, or at least the most common deck of each color. Um, and given that, that's a decent amount of variety for a card game where people could argue the top tier is only 3 or 4 decks tops, maybe like 2 or 3 decks, I guess, in its most restrictive cases. Um, so that we saying us saying, I guess, that you could take red hybrid and expect to do well. I believe Um, you're not necessarily favored in certain matchups. Um, assuming, but assuming you know what you're doing, and assuming you know your outs, at least to see them when they present themselves, I think is a good place to be in, especially when we are in a meta. As you mentioned, I believe we've kind of gone full circle. I believe we're at the point where people are very comfortable, and for you to take something that's slightly off color and know it well, I guess that's the difference though, because traditionally, um, it is fair to say that if you were your average person who is playing a slightly less meta deck, it means they're a slightly less competitively minded person because they value playing the less meta deck and the like just enjoying the deck more than they value potentially competitive integrity. So, like the purple Myotismon is an easy example. I would never recommend somebody bring purple Myotismon to this event, but um, obviously I did lose to it that one time, and it was mostly because that person dedicated themselves, like they really like Myotismon, and that's kind of all that person's played. So for them to know and understand that deck, and especially have infinitely more experience versus my deck than I have had theirs, they took advantage of that. And in a single best of three, that's all you have to ask of your deck and of yourself.
And like being a deck loyalist isn't a bad thing either. Um, just because like Nako said, they'll know their deck inside and out, how to play the matchups, and you might not be very familiar with them and theirs. You might understand what their cards do, but you might not understand what they're trying to do and how they're trying to use their cards because like I make a lot of decks. I have a very good broad spectrum of almost any deck in the entire game at this point. Not trying to brag or anything. It's just like I do make a lot of decks. I do a lot of research. I make sure that I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about it. And like that gives me a lot of knowledge, but I might not understand like the nuances of how something might be played in the hands of a deck loyalist. It's like they could take my Myotismon deck, refine it to a degree where it could look something similar, but it could be completely different, and they would have a better understanding on how to play that deck than I would if they were to take it to an event. And again, trying to shout out Joe Dabi, he doesn't look at Japanese data. Like Japanese data is only good to a certain degree, and you have to do some like exploratory exploration on your own to figure things out. And you could use Japan and their data as a little bit of a guide, but it shouldn't be the end all be all.
Yeah. Um, I
Because I
really
know Ben Lee does the same type of thing. He doesn't look at Japanese data at all, and he tries various different things, and sometimes he's successful, sometimes he's not. That's just the nature of the beast.
um I guess my final thoughts are just that uh be a deck loyalist if you have a deck that you are loyal to. Um, if you are someone who prefers to follow the meta and play meta decks, or you've just, I guess most people at this point have kind of picked a deck in BT7 that they're playing, or they've picked a small handful and they're just deciding upon one of them for this weekend's events. Um, just make sure you understand it. Try don't bring something you're unprepared to play. Um, at least like I guess at a bare minimum, I'd say blue, yellow, and probably purple. I guess if I had to pick a third, but you'd do really well just knowing blue and yellow. Um, but my I guess final new point just being know when to quit, kind of. Um, I kind of really fell in love with the Diaboromon engine for this set, but it just kind of can't beat blue. Um, in general, it does fantastic into yellow, and that's why I enjoyed it initially. But it is so bad into a Zulonglon, it's not even funny. Um, and that kind of kills the deck, like straight up for me. Like I've tried Machine Dramon a little bit too. I tried less with that deck, but a deck that exclusively cares about building very specific sources that it versus a deck that doesn't give a shit and just strips them, it feels really bad. So do your testing, know your deck, and also know when you're making a wrong meta call. That's I guess that's the line as a competitive player to me. If you're trying to be competitive and you're trying to reach those top tables, know when to throw in the towel, at least as far as trying to force a deck to work. I know there's a lot of echo chambers out there, specifically with Cherubimon and certain discords, but um, the idea being that like if you can't make a deck work, just don't. Like I mean the likelihood at this point that someone's going to like pull something out of their ass that no one has ever heard of or thought of is unlikely. I know you mentioned Jodabi. I have no idea what he's been playing, but um
I'm
a-
not going to divulge that
oh,
secret.
I know.
I
I wouldn't ask, but I also I wouldn't even begin to guess either. But like my example I feel like holding true is I don't think it's anything that if I was told about, I wouldn't be like, "Oh, I could see how that could work," or I think I could see how that deck could do well. Like, I don't think someone's going to be able to tell me a deck that I couldn't at least imagine how it works. Like, no one's going to come up with something that unique. There are only so many cards we really have to work with. Um, but knowing when your deck doesn't work is a very good place to be because I think knowing your weaknesses really give you a grasp of knowing your strengths.
I would agree with that sentiment.
Like I said, like I tried to make Diaboromon work, and I liked it because of how much it like slapped around Yellow Hybrid, and I didn't like losing the Yellow Hybrid, and I was preparing for a meta full of security control hiding behind a small little girl. Um, but instead, it was Blue Hybrid, and they don't hide behind anything except for sadness. My sadness. Um, so yeah, just pick a deck, practice with it. You still have time. Assuming you're listening to this as soon as it comes out. Um, if you haven't, what are you doing? Clearly, you should have been, but um, just try not to pick a flavor of the month deck. You don't have to play blue hybrids to win this event. I promise you, people have been winning with other decks, and I think you just have to know how to beat blue hybrids to win this event, decidedly.
I would say that that's very true. Like we've gotten to a point of apathy where everyone's just like given up and just accepted the self-fulfilling prophecy at this point where it's just like, oh boy, blue hybrids, here we go again. But yeah, if you're just well seasoned on blue hybrids and you know what your deck is doing and you have that practice and you have that tech, you could probably beat them without them even realizing you're beating them.
Yeah, like there is a lot of that bias, at least initially, potentially. As you start to get to top tables, usually that fades a little bit, and you start to encounter people that are like, okay, clearly they're doing something different, and that's why they're here. Like, I'm way more scared of somebody flipping like uh, a red hybrid matchup at like you know top 50 tables in round 7 than I am round 1. But um, at that same time, um, you can still uh, win that way. Or even if you're someone who wants to play blue hybrid and you're confident in the mirror match and you're confident in beating all these flavor of the month people, you can just profit off of and farm the people who are basically trying to copy you and not understand their deck. If you do understand the deck and you're practiced on it, then just flex on them, really.
And I think that's kind of why like certain decks that are able to last multiple formats generally are still like really favored is because you know what your deck has been doing and you just had more time to practice that deck versus a wider variety of decks. So it gives you more flexibility in terms of like being a well-rounded player in a large event to be able to beat lots of different decks. So like that's why Jesmon still does so well is because people have been playing Jesmon since BT6. And we're almost entering BT8 and Jesmon is still going to be good. And like that's going to be kind of crazy to think about. All of that experience on a Jesmon loyalist is going to start adding up, and they could eventually do very, very well at an event when their matchups line up and their plays line up, and they just are firing on all cylinders.
Yep. So I guess that's the parting knowledge is just to pick something, stick with it, and know your shit. Because um, especially as the tournaments get longer, the better player is more likely to win.
Yeah, and there is just a lot of different tech options that your decks can have. Depending on what you're choosing, you might have more options than others, but really understanding what your options are, how to use them efficiently, and what you're trying to do with your deck as a whole, not only to advance your game state with your tech, but to try to be able to beat what the opponent's deck is doing with your tech, also really helps a lot.
Um, I know we talked a lot about Blue Hybrid specifically, only because it's the easiest example for me, and for most people, if you're actually trying to play into or against Blue Hybrid, I feel like that's most people at this point, if not everyone, at least trying to beat it, even if you're also playing it. But um, uh, Sneets and I talked beforehand, and we were basically trying to avoid uh, it becoming a singularly focused episode on like one deck and how to tech one deck. But if that's something you're interested in, let us know. Only because we're not opposed to it, but we just felt as though it was easier and more applicable to do something more general initially.
Yep. So just let us know any feedback as far as like other topics or subjects you want us to go over. Like we appreciate what you have to offer and what you have to say.
Yeah, I know. Um, we're not huge. We don't claim to be. Um, and with the like minimal amount of interaction we really see either between Zenitsu's Discord or just like the YouTube comment section itself, you almost guarantee, as long as you're not talking completely out of your ass, you're gonna get some sort of response, and even then, maybe so. But we
Or
want,
at least to read. I am reading everything.
yeah, um, as well as I am. Just the idea that we could better facilitate specific discussion if it's so inclined. Um, we're doing our best to cover things that we feel as though are important or topical, but if anyone else has suggestions, we're definitely not opposed to that either.
Yep.
Okay, with that, I believe we're going to close it out. So, goodbye.
Bye.